Cornel West has long been one of America's foremost public intellectuals, often associated with the American left, and frequently an endorser of Democratic Party presidential candidates, even while offering scathing critiques of the party. Professor West is now causing a great deal of concern, angst, and even anger among Democrats as a result of his announcement that this year he will run for president on the Green Party ticket. He's a graduate of Harvard College with a PhD in philosophy from Princeton, and during his academic career, he has held teaching positions at Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and Dartmouth. He's the author of more than a dozen books, including the highly acclaimed 1983 work Race Matters and his 2004 treatise entitled Democracy Matters. In both the 2016 and 2020 election, Dr. West supported the Democratic primary challenge of Bernie Sanders. Once Sanders dropped out in 2016 amidst allegations of cheating, well-documented allegations of cheating by the DNC on behalf of Hillary Clinton, West endorsed Green Party candidate Jill Stein. Though in 2020 he endorsed, after Sanders dropped out, Joe Biden in the general election. Dr. West has for decades been one of this country's most independent-minded and interesting thinkers, and as part of our quest to interview as many presidential candidates as we can on this program, we are delighted to welcome him to his debut appearance on System Up to Date tonight for our interview segment. Dr. West, good evening. It's great to see you. How are you?
Oh, my brother, it's a blessing to see you. And I just want to begin by saluting you, being the force for good for so long, from reading you in The Guardian and bringing the critique to bear on the neoliberalism that was just beginning to really consolidate under Obama. You were consistent then, and then on to Brazil. And of course, our dear brother David, my thoughts and my prayers are with him and your precious kids. But I just say it's a joy to be in direct conversation with you, man. After all of these years, we've never really had a chance to just talk. And so this is beautiful for me.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. We did do that event, I don't know if you recall, about 18 months ago with Professor Butler on issues of identity politics and the like, but not a one-on-one conversation. And it's been too long.
But you were zoomed in. You were zoomed in from Brazil.
Exactly.
Crutchley.
Exactly.
Right.
We'll have to do it in person
exactly right.
soon enough. So I want to begin. I have a lot of questions. I'm very excited by your presence here with your candidacy itself. It's not a lot of things that I say this about when it comes to the Democratic Party. They are very good at certain things, one of which is smearing third-party candidates. They blame, as you know, Ralph Nader for the election of George Bush in 2000. They blame Jill Stein for the 2016 defeat of Hillary Clinton. They're very good at blaming everybody but themselves when they lose elections. And third-party candidates in particular are people they love to villainize. They recently sent out the Clinton-era consultant James Carville to preview how they're going to attack you on CNN, namely by saying essentially that the only purpose of your candidacy is to elect Donald Trump. So let me just show you a little bit of that, and I'm going to ask you to respond to Mr. Carville. Let's go ahead and show that clip.
Jill Stein, who's his campaign manager, is almost certainly an agent of the Russian government. If you don't believe me, somebody at home Google photo General Flynn, Vladimir Putin, Jill Stein. She was hosted by the Russians prior to her running in 2016. So, people are going to have to decide that we want to continue under our Constitution, because Donald Trump is telling us that very clearly is bragging about the fact that he doesn't want to live under the Constitution anymore. And it's very clear that the only thing that Dr. West's candidacy can do is help elect Donald Trump. It's nothing. I don't think any of that's inarguable, nor is it arguable that Jill Stein had deep relationships with the Russian government.
All right, so it's kind of amazing to me, at least, though maybe I'm just naive at this point, that Anderson Cooper just sat there and let James Carville accuse Jill Stein of being a Russian agent with no evidence whatsoever. But let's leave that to the side for a second, because of course that's what Democrats do, is they call people Russian agents, whoever they dislike. And let me ask you about I guess what you can call the substantive critique, that the only possible effect of your candidacy is that you're going to help elect Donald Trump. What's your answer to that?
Yeah, well, I mean, one is I'm not convinced of that at all, but I do want to say that I just don't like the vicious attack on anybody, including my dear sister Jill Stein. It's an example of Brother Carville being a spokesman of a party that is so radically undemocratic and unsocratic. It seems that the Democratic Party has lost the capacity to critically examine itself, to be critical of itself, and wonder why it is that it continually reproduces such milquetoast candidates that don't speak not just to poor and working people, but what you were talking about earlier in your show, my brother, which is protection of personal liberty, the authoritarian impulse of the Democratic Party tied to their links to big money and big military has led them to give up on both democratic processes within their own party in terms of no debates in the primary, but also the degree to which it's become authoritarian with the undercutting of the personal liberties of journalists, citizens. And I come from a black freedom tradition, brother, where there's been COINTELPRO, pre-COINTELPRO surveillance, during COINTELPRO, post-COINTELPRO surveillance against those who are doing what? Simply lifting our voices and trying to tell the truth about the suffering of the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow and Jane Crow and predatory capitalist processes, let alone the drones dropped on innocent people in the name of the American empire, but killing very, very precious human beings. So it's a very sad sight to hear my dear brother Carville saying that. And think about it, though, man. I haven't had one public event. The first one's going to be in Mississippi on August 25th with the Emmett Till family. I haven't had one fundraising event. And yet I become this menace to society, to the very continuation of the constitutional order. Wow. Boy, that's a sign of panic that really goes far beyond the imagination, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, and I think a lot, like I said, I think a lot more is coming your way when it comes to that. So you have had a life where you are respected by a lot of people across the political spectrum. You still are. You, of course, know, you've been around long enough to know that you're going to get a lot of attacks. There are going to be a lot worse ones than that. That's just kind of the toe in the water. And so I guess what I wanted to get a sense of is, and I ask anyone running for president this because it is a lot of work. It's something that you have to put yourself out there and get a lot of attacks. And I really believe that anyone who does it has to have a couple of really strong animating principles that they want to at least bring light to, if not change. What are those for you? What are the kind of, without being reductive, sort of 2 or 3 real issues that you think made it so that during these attacks was worth it for you?
Well, keep in mind, I mean, I've been attacked for the last 35, 40 years, major controversies with Harvard President Larry Summers and then Larry Bacow as well. So it's never, for me, been a question of popularity and reputation. It's really about integrity and vocation. I want to be true to my own calling, and that calling has so much to do with all of the love and integrity and courage that was poured into me by Irene B. West and Clifton West, my family. Memory to me is inseparable from any sense of calling. It's tied to Shiloh Baptist Church, Willie P. Cook and Deacon Hinton and the others, and the Black Panther Party right down the street, and that fusion of the spirituality of the prophetic black church of Martin King and Fannie Lou Hamer, and then the Black Panther Party focused not just on the poor, but on predatory capitalist processes, ways in which empires around the world colonize, subjugate others, but always keeping moral and spiritual dimensions alive. So it's just the following through of my calling, my brother. It really isn't spilling over into electoral politics, but it's been the same in the classroom. It's been the same in the jail cell. It's been the same on the streets. And for me, it's been the same in the nightclub. You see this John Coltrane right here, though, brother, that loves Supreme. That's my tradition, man. It's that black musical tradition is all about catastrophe. It's all about swing, different conceptions of time that authorize better futures. And it's all about improvisation, being flexible and fluid rather than dogmatic and doctrinaire. And that's precisely why I stand with you in your strong and rich libertarian sensibilities. If we cannot protect voices to be raised in the face of forms of censorship, then we cannot have decent societies, let alone democratic ones. The very anthem of black people is what? Lift every voice. That's the Johnson brothers. Lift every voice, not lift every echo. The echo is just an extension of a silo. A voice is critical, Socratic, A voice is prophetic, full of compassion for the least of these. And that sits at the very center of the black musical tradition, the black freedom tradition. And I would go as far as to say, when you bring together Socratic legacies of Athens and prophetic legacies of Jerusalem, some of the best legacies of the species, my brother.
You alluded earlier to the fact that, I've been a critic of the neoliberalism of the Democratic Party for a long time. You've been a critic of that neoliberalism even longer. And I want to propose to you that I do think the Democratic Party has changed for the worse, even given those kind of harsh critiques that you were voicing, that I was voicing during the Obama administration, especially when it comes to things like imperialism and war and foreign policy. This war in Ukraine is the number one goal of the CIA, of NATO, of the EU, of the war-making machine. And it just is a fact that the only opposition is coming from the populist sort of right wing of the Republican Party. Every single last Democrat voted yes unanimously, from AOC and Cori Bush to Chuck Schumer and Joe Manchin, for $40 billion authorization the last time they had to vote. They just had some more votes. Democrats were again united. It seems to me like what were once significant issues, at least for a lot of people on the left who nonetheless supported the Democratic Party, things like foreign policy, imperialism, war, the abuses of the U.S. security state, have fallen way down on the list of priorities, if they even make the list at all. Do you share that impression?
Oh, absolutely. There's no doubt about it. We know since 1973 or 4, with the challenge of the production of oil shifting from Texas to the Middle East. At that time, it was a challenge of Japanese and West German marketeers and capitalists putting pressure on the United States. So the United States came up with a new class project, and it was actually a class war against poor and working people called neoliberalism, the unleashing of markets, the deregulating of markets, and trying to ensure the various sites, lands, territories for those U.S. markets to penetrate and to gain access to the cheap labor that was there. So as the American empire began to engage in external decline and internal decay, the Democratic Party itself became more and more the bedrock of marketeering, with window dressing with various black faces and brown faces and women's faces. And it's very important. I think it's crucial to defend the rights of our precious trans, some of the most viciously attacked in our society, our precious gays, precious lesbians, and so forth. And I'm glad Democratic Party is ready to make that move in that direction. But alongside of that was the consolidation of the American imperial project, with the turn of the party toward corporate power. That's what the Democratic Leadership Council was all about with Clinton. And from Clinton through Obama all the way up to Biden, you have a Democratic Party so locked into corporate elites, locked into military elites and the marketeers, making money with the arm manufacturing taking place, that it becomes very difficult for the Democratic Party to not be viewed as a party that's beyond redemption. It is so captured by big money, so captured by big military, that it makes Martin Luther King turn over in the grave. He had to engage in his particular LBJ. He didn't know that the LBJ trajectory in Vietnam would become the dominant one for the Democratic Party, and the acknowledgement, and this is last but not least, of the decentering of the American empire, which is taking place with the emergence of BRICS, and not the emergence, but the power of BRICS, the power of the organized global South, and the ways in which the United States begins to hold on for dear life. And the result is what? Donald Trump, gangster to the core, neo-fascist, leading the country toward a second civil war, and then Biden, milquetoast, hypocritical, mendacious, leading toward a third world war. And so the choice in 2024 is, do you want a second civil war with Brother Trump? Do you want a third world war with the proxy war against Russia of the American empire, with our precious Ukrainian brothers and sisters caught in the middle? What a choice. We're between a rock and a hard place. Well, one of the reasons why I raised my voice, and thank God, I have a certain visibility, is say, hey, I've got to try to tell the truth about this, and I had to try to bear justice to it. And I also have to try to keep the joy in it, though, man, because we live in some very bleak and grim times, and we can't keep our spirits up with our loves and family and music and community as we intervene into life and death issues, saving the planet, dismantling the American empire, and at the same time trying to unleash democratic possibilities all around the world for the wretched of the earth, in the language of the great Franz Fanon.
You know, you mentioned Dr. King, and almost every year on his birthday, that's now a national holiday, maybe not every year, every other year, so I write about his speech that for me was one of the most consequential, if not to me the most consequential, which is the one he gave in Riverside Church in April of 1967, exactly 1 year to the day that he was assassinated. And it was entitled Beyond Silence and Betrayal. It was about the Vietnam War, and he kind of meant his own silence and betrayal, that he had kind of let himself be convinced that he should stay away from foreign policy and imperialism issues and only focus on domestic progress, and finally realized there's actually no such thing as separating domestic progress and war making, that if we're going to be this imperial power, there's never going to be domestic progress. And he kind of apologized for being late to the Vietnam War, and that he got attacked by the New York Times and the Washington Post kind of telling him, look, you stick to your racial justice issues and leave foreign policy alone. You're going to alienate a lot of people, including us. One of the arguments I've seen a lot of people making, including people who like you and admire your work, is that it's absolutely clear that the lesser of two evils, if it's Trump versus Biden, Trump versus DeSantis, is the lesser of two evils is clearly Joe Biden, and that therefore maybe if you live in a state that's a safe state, one way or the other, either automatically red or blue, go ahead and vote for you as kind of sending a message to the Democratic Party. But if you live in one of those 10 or 12 swing states, the obligation is vote for Joe Biden because he's clearly the lesser of two evils. No attempt made to analyze what that means. As you were saying, it kind of seems to ignore foreign policy and war and World War III and the like. Do you accept that premise about the lesser of two evils? And is that the time to be guided in terms of how we vote?
Yeah, I think that framework is just too narrow. You see, if you accept that framework, then you accept the only possibilities we'll ever have would be these fascist catastrophes on the one hand and the authoritarian neoliberal catastrophes on the other. There's got to be something more than that. There's got to be something more than that. And I'm glad you mentioned Brother Martin's great speech given exactly a year before he was murdered and assassinated, and partly tied, of course, to the U.S. nation state in some form, as Mrs. King believed. And the reason why I say that is, one is that speech was written for the most part by the great Vincent Harding, who was one of the towering figures, and highly encouraged by the great Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who introduced Martin at that Riverside event. And his speech actually is worth looking at as it moves into Martin's speech. And what both of them were suggesting was, if we don't come up with a movement, and my campaign is just a moment in a movement, though, brother. If we don't have a stronger mass people's movement than any candidate, it's just a kind of sounding brass, tinkling cymbal coming and going. It's a matter of trying to get people awakening, a more awakening and a spiritual reckoning. But it also has to shatter our perspective. And this goes back to Brother Carville again. Same would be true with Brother Axelrod. So the only perspective available is the establishmentarian lens, the New York Times, given all of its lies and misinformation about black people and working people and poor people over its tenure, or the Washington Post. That mainstream lens, that's the only lens to view the world, and hence you end up a lesser evil. No, I look at the world first as a Christian. You know, the 25th chapter of Matthew, brother. The least of these. I've taught in prison for 41 years. Mass incarceration, untouched, reinforced by both parties. Oh, excuse me.
Do you have some water there or something, or you want to take a second?
Well, I think I can bounce back. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, we can hear you fine. I just want to make sure everything's fine and don't put pressure on yourself if you're still coughing.
Yeah,
Just
I probably should have had a little water. But let me move into my Barry White mode here a little bit deeper. That if you look at the world through the lens of those precious Palestinians on the West Bank, doesn't make any difference with Democrats or Republicans. If you look at the world through the vantage point of the Lanzas workers in Brazil, it doesn't make any difference. You look at the world through the vantage points of those on reservations, in hoods, and barrios, both parties symbolic gestures toward their ugly plight. And so part of our ripening, remember Shakespeare says ripening is all. Part of the ripening is how do we look at the world not in terms of just short-term caretaking governments against fascism, as opposed to long-term uprooting of fascism. Neoliberalism will never uproot fascism. You have to have a broader vision, a deeper calling, intense passion to fight. And people would say, well, we don't have that. There'll never be a mass movement. West is naive. You better come back in this establishmentarian perspective and make a choice between the lesser evils. I said, no, not at all. That's not my tradition. Not at all. Thanks so much. My blessed wife just brought me some things here, bro.
all right, great.
Thank you for your patience. Ooh, I'm feeling better already. I'm about to sing a song. I do a little.
We want a little musical interlude now that you're all hydrated. I think we're almost ready for one.
Feeling good,
All right.
brother.
So let me ask you, because there was something you said there that I really want to zero in on, because as I was listening to these people, I was referring to just asserting like it was the most obvious thing in the world. It doesn't require any debate whatsoever, that Biden is the lesser of two evils, and that's the only way that we have to look at the world. Being in Brazil has enabled me to interview a lot of Latin American leaders over the last decade or so, including Evo Morales in Bolivia and Rafael Correa in Ecuador, and obviously Lula da Silva and Dilma Rousseff in Brazil. And if you ask them that question, they will tell you it doesn't matter at all whether it's Obama or Trump or Clinton or Bush. It looks exactly the same to them from their perspective, exactly as you just said. And one of the distinguishing features of Latin American politics, and left-wing Latin American politics in particular, is it has always been imbued with this sort of religious tradition. That's true in Central America. It's true in South America, that Christianity, Catholicism has always played an important part in shaping left-wing politics in Latin America. Whereas in the U.S., especially now, if you're on the left, you talk about religion, it's just very anathema to how left-wing politics is understood. Religion is obviously a crucial part of your worldview. Can you talk a little bit about how it shapes your vision and how you want to use the religious matrix or vision to talk more about politics in a way that connects to people who otherwise might not be reachable?
Well, I think there's two levels there. One has to do with just very personal, existential level in regard to what one's own commitments and convictions are shaped in light of the world view that one has. And then the second is the role of religion within the shaping of the consciousness of a larger community. I'm a product of the Black freedom movement, right? I'm a product of a tradition of Black people who have been hated chronically for 400 years, dishing out love warriors every generation. And so many of those love warriors, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Malcolm X, Martin King, Marcus Garvey, Fannie Lou Hamer, they're all deeply religious folk. In the case that I've talked about were Christian and Muslim. Bell Hooks, one of my dear sisters, Buddhist, that the Black freedom struggle has always had a significant, if not near majority, of leaders who are profoundly religious, but in the prophetic sense. You know what I mean? Not dogma and doctrine, not abstract talk about values. No. This is not a fight against science. It's a fight against despair. It's a fight against nihilism. And so I am very much a product of that Black freedom struggle, where you're going to run into so many deeply religious folk when you go to jail. You're going to run into religious folk when you're in demonstrations, when you're in left-wing formations. Now, we have some rich secular minds from Richard Wright to a host of others. There's no doubt about that, the Martin Kilsons and others. But there's no contradiction now. Race Matters was first translated in Portuguese in Brazil. I went down there. And that's the first time I heard of Lula, got a chance to meet him very briefly. That was 1980 something. He was working the Workers' Party, I recall. That must have been almost 40 years ago. And he was not that well known in terms of having the potential of becoming a politician and a president. I can say that. He was out there in the favelas and I had a great time. I learned a lot. And of course, the liberation theology movement there with the Christian-based communities. I was blessed to speak almost 22 times when I was down there in Brazil. I learned so much. Sorry I didn't pick up too much Portuguese, my brother, but I learned so many
hard.
insights.
It's not easy. So we'll forgive you for that. But there is definitely a huge tradition. One of the things that is so interesting is, there's been a lot of pressure on President Lula to support the war in Ukraine, to fuel the proxy war in Ukraine, to send ammunition that fits with the German tanks that were sent. And he has repeatedly refused. He said at least 50% of the blame for that war lies with NATO and Zelensky for getting him revved up into believing he can win the war. Whenever he's kind of pressured by the international community, as they call themselves, meaning Western Europe and the US and whoever agrees with them at the moment, he says my war is with poverty and the Brazilian people's suffering and not with Russia or with Ukraine. What do you think explains this kind of obsession that the establishment class in the United States has with this war in Ukraine, and why have so many people on the left tolerated the Democratic Party prosecuting this with very little dissent? What's going on there?
Well, I mean, one, as we said before, the Democratic Party has been a party, not just of Wall Street, but of war. And Brother Biden, of course, has never really seen a war that he didn't support. Now, unlike my dear brother Lula, though, I would say that I am deeply concerned about poverty in the United States and in Brazil, but I'm also concerned about the suffering of the Ukrainian people. And I'm thoroughly convinced that a ceasefire is the best thing that would terminate the suffering, even given the criminal invasion of Putin and the Russian Federation. Meaning what? Meaning that it's not just steps toward World War, steps toward escalating the war. We know Clausewitz has taught us that war has this life and logic of its own, that we lose control of it immediately. But also the fact that we've got elites in Washington tied to Pentagon and other places who view Russia on the one hand and China on the other hand as the two major concerns, if not targets. The great W.B. Du Bois wrote an essay in June 26, 1945. He was leaving San Francisco after the founding of the United Nations. He wrote it in the Chicago Defender, which is a black newspaper. It's called The Winds of Time. He said, I see a third world war that has to do with the suppression of Asia and the strangling of Russia. And he was talking about the American empire emerging after the end of the age of Europe and the decentering of European empires after that indescribably evil Holocaust of our Jewish brothers and sisters, after the end of the millions dead in World War II. Now, Du Bois saw then the American empire obsessed with suppression of Asia, strangling of Russia. What's going on right now? Now, of course, he's not infallible, but what a prediction. And so much of what's going on in Ukraine right now is an attempt to use NATO as an arm of American imperial power as it tilts toward Asia and tries to suppress China. And we could have a possible war with China over Taiwan, just as the war escalates in the Ukraine. And then, of course, with Trump, the Civil War escalating in the United States. What do? We can't remain silent. What do? We got to keep telling the truth. What do? We got to keep fighting for justice. What do? We got to keep loving folk, and especially loving the deeply unloved and subjugated and hated and terrorized and traumatized poor people of whatever color, gender, or sexual orientation around the world. What else can we do? And that's very much what this campaign is all about. We refuse to be silent in the face of the ugly militarism of the Democratic Party and its ties to corporate elites and the neo-fascism escalating the Republican Party.
So
what else can we do, my brother?
Absolutely. So let me ask you about that. And just to be clear, when Lula says my war is with poverty in Brazil, he doesn't mean I'm indifferent to Ukraine. What he means is I don't think fueling the war would help the Ukrainian people, given they're the ones suffering the most. And he's,
he and I on the same line.
Yeah, he's been,
I just wanted to add that. I just wanted to know. We agree wholeheartedly.
Absolutely. He's been flying around the world trying to kind of forge a peace deal, and kind of angry and shocked that not only is there no attempt in the West by Biden and NATO to forge a peace deal, but they seem eager to block anyone who's actually forging that effort. Let me ask you.
I'm glad my African elected officials are doing similar things, even though I'm critical of them as African bourgeoisie that are not speaking to the needs of their own poor and working people, but they're playing a very important role here in terms of trying to find some just peace for our precious Ukrainian brothers and sisters.
Well, let me ask you, you heard me talking earlier about the history of the FBI, the CIA, Homeland Security, which honestly, it really shocks me. I think for a lot of people on the American left, broadly speaking, that sense of history has kind of been gone for a lot of people. Maybe it's just being younger. They focus on one issue and one issue only, which is the advent of Donald Trump, and that's all they know is history from 2015 onward. A lot of them see the CIA, the FBI, and the U.S. security state almost as like they're allies, because clearly there was a lot of attempt on the part of those agencies to subvert and undermine the Trump presidency for various reasons. Can you talk a little bit? There was this recent case that I thought was so helpful, where it wasn't just conservatives, but several black leftist radicals were indicted, alleged to be agents of the Russian government on the most trivial charges. The media didn't care. Very few people on the left objected. Talk a little bit about kind of the history of the FBI and the CIA and the U.S. security state when it comes to radical anti-establishment politics, because I don't think there's a lot of sense of that history any longer, certainly among Democratic Party supporters, and even unfortunately among a lot of people who identify as the left.
No, you're so right, though. And we could begin again with Martin Luther King Jr. and the fact that he was under such vicious surveillance. And, I do have a deep love and respect for Brother RFK Jr. I may not agree with him on a number of issues of Israel and free market capitalism or what have you. But I think he's a very, very decent brother in his own way. But it was his father, of course, along with his uncle, who put Brother Martin under surveillance when they were in power. And I think that because I come out of a tradition where I know, to love black people, to love poor and working people means you will be under surveillance, means you have to deal with character assassination, means that you have a chance of being literally assassinated. Black love is a crime in a white supremacist society, my brother. And we all have to be able to pay that price if we're serious about it. So what that means is for the younger generation, they need to know that this surveillance state that you're talking about is not abstract. It is concrete. It is operating on the ground in a number of different ways. And a lot of people don't wake up until it comes to their house. You know what I mean? A lot of people don't wake up until their own friends are affected by it. The African People's Socialist Party and Brother Amali, it came to their house. I think it's wrong. I think it's unwarranted. I stand with them. But I know Brother Mumia Abdul-Jamal has been on death row, still in prison. I know H. Rap Brown in Arizona, in prison. Leonard Beltier in prison. Brother Snowden in exile, can't come back. Julian Assange, oh my dear brother Julian. My God, what they've tried to do to him, to crush him. And he's still going for what? exposing the ugly war crimes of the American empire, and yet those who committed the crimes are free. See, those are the kind of realities that we cannot deny or overlook, and yet it will never, ever dampen our spirit. That will never have the last word in terms of our willingness to fight, tell the truth, love, laugh, and continue to keep swinging.
All right, well, I refuse to not let that be the last note that we end on because of how powerful it was, how much I think people need to hear it. I very much hope that this will not be our last conversation. It took so long, way too long for us to have our first one, person to person at least. I'd love for you to keep coming back on, talk about the campaign as it's unfolding, issues as they emerge. Like I said, I always find you to be an extremely valuable voice. I'm thrilled that you're making use of your platform in the way that you are, and I really appreciate your taking the time to talk to us tonight.
Thank you, my brother. Salute you now, man. Stay strong.
All right, you too. Have a great evening. Bye-bye. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.